All right. So now what we're going to be talking about is a branch of the nervous system that really is certainly a functional branch of the nervous system, but it also entails a structural component as well. So we're not going to be looking at particular brain areas or particular areas of the spinal cord, but we're going to be looking at a division of the nervous system that is called the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is also, I tend to think of it as the automatic nervous system because it is automatically handling a number of aspects about homeostasis that you don't have to think about. So when we look at the different organs and tissues that it's going to innervate, we can see a number of these are involuntary, right? Smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, different types of glands like sweat glands and salivary glands, etc. So subconscious control, like I said, I tend to call it the automatic nervous system in a general way. It's also called the involuntary nervous system, or sometimes the general visceral motor system. So what we have here is this is a branch of the peripheral nervous system. So we talked about central already. We have another chapter on peripheral as well. So this is going to and from the body. And when we look at it, right, this is coming from the body, right? Sensory or afferent. Sensory is equal to afferent, and motor is equal to efferent, right? Same. So there's our M, there's our E, same. So in this motor division, we had talked a bit about the somatic nervous system, like when we were talking about the muscular system and the neuromuscular junction, when we talked about neurons running out to any of those skeletal muscles. That's the somatic nervous system, which moves the body. But this, like I said, is kind of the automatic nervous system, also called the autonomic, more correctly, that then has two divisions to it as well. It's got the fight or flight division and the rest and digest division. So what does that mean? So one of the big things before we get into the details of it is you want to be able to compare. We know that this is motor going out, right? Not sensory coming in. But what we're controlling are these involuntary organs. So those are different than our voluntary ones we saw with the somatic nervous system. So we want to be able to compare them in terms of, like we already said, the effectors that they're innervating, but also the pathways that they're using, and how those target organs respond. You can even think of how they get to that site as well. So effectors, like we said, skeletal muscle, voluntary muscle, versus involuntary muscle like cardiac and smooth, as well as those glands. We also find, like I said, the pathway is different. So I have a diagram of that coming up. Let's see if I can jump to that. So we'll see this in a few different ways coming up, but here's somatic nervous system at the top. So with the somatic nervous system, like we saw before, we're going to have one neuron that is exiting the central nervous system. So there's our multipolar neuron, motor neuron, in the central nervous system, like the spinal cord, and we have one long neuron that goes all the way to the skeletal muscle, releases a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, and that stimulates the muscle cell to contract. It's stimulatory. Now in the autonomic nervous system, whereas somatic it took one, autonomic it takes two. Okay, so in all the examples that we see here of the autonomic nervous system for both divisions, we see that it takes two to get all the way to the effector organ, in this case our involuntary muscle. And what we find is it can be both or one, it can be stimulatory like we saw in the voluntary aspect, or it can be inhibitory. All right, so I thought that seeing the diagram kind of helped out. So different in effectors, different in the pathways as well. And also, we'll look at these things that are ganglions. Remember, ganglions are where we have cell bodies that we're kind of bundling them together, etc. Now, also in terms of neurotransmitters, right? Somatic nervous system release acetylcholine that is stimulatory. And in the autonomic nervous system, we see that a bit. So preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine, Postganglionic fibers release either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. So when we look at that, what does it mean in terms of a ganglion? So this is the housing like we see here, or like we see here, that's going to hold that junction together between the two neurons that are relaying that message out. So, like we said, this one's going to be a preganglionic cell then occurring before it. Then this one's going to be a postganglionic cell. Postganglionic cell, preganglionic cell, right? So we saw that when we were talking about the nervous system before, right? Presynaptic cell, postsynaptic cell. Whatever synapse we're focusing on, that's how we get pre and post. And now we're looking at a ganglion. So between the pre and postganglionic cell, we have acetylcholine. We can get acetylcholine being the neurotransmitter even from the postganglionic cell, but we see norepinephrine can be a neurotransmitter as well at the end of this pathway. So norepinephrine is for sympathetic division, right? So sympathetic fight or flight, you hear about epinephrine, norepinephrine. So those are basically like adrenaline, right? Adrenaline, noradrenaline. And so this is our fight or flight. And so it makes sense that at the end of this sympathetic response, fight or flight, you're going to get something like norepinephrine, which is going to tend to speed up a lot of things. Now, when we look at parasympathetic, the phrase that goes with that is rest and digest. And when we look at the neurotransmitter, we see acetylcholine there, and we see it here. So it's acetylcholine all the way through. That makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so that's where we're seeing the difference in terms of the release of the neurotransmitter at the postganglionic cell. So overlap, we were looking at differences. You got to be able to do those compare those differences, but there is some overlap as well. So what we find is a lot of the pathways are the same, that will use similar spinal or cranial nerves, and there, in some cases, we're going to find that some of the responses are going to need both types of neurons and their stimulation to affect your organs, right? So if you're going to be running or something like that, you need to stimulate those skeletal muscles. You're also going to need to stimulate the heart, increase the heart rate, maybe constrict the blood vessels or dilate others, dilate the ones going down to the legs, etc. All right, so this figure right here, figure 14.2, is certainly an important one that does a lot of those important comparisons for us. So make a note of it. All right, so like we said, two different divisions of the autonomic nervous system, rest and digest, that promotes maintaining and conserving energy, whereas sympathetic is getting your body ready for stress. Now this could be stress on a very low level or a high level. It's not always an emergency. It could just be the stress of an exam or something like that, or running on the treadmill or whatever. But what we find, as I'm describing it to you, they sound pretty opposite. So they're usually antagonistic to one another. But what we find is that our organs that we're innervating usually have what's called dual, sympathetic and parasympathetic, dual innervation, and often it's reciprocal. Whereas one increases it, the other decreases the activity of that particular organ. And that allows us to have a very precise control over the response of that organ, right? Like the gas pedal and the brake on your car. You control how much is moving forward. Now, in theory, you can do that just with the gas pedal. So you take your foot off the gas, eventually you're going to stop. Push the gas, you're going to go. But with the brake, and both of those, you can very precisely control that. Okay, so like we said, parasympathetic, rest and digest. So with rest and digest, you can imagine digestive functions are going to be important. Diuresis, urinating, defecation, a lot of those systems are going to increase, right? Because you're sitting on the couch, coming up pretty soon if you're thinking about Thanksgiving. Those systems are going to increase, but we're going to find that there are other ones that decrease, like cardiovascular, etc. Sympathetic fight or flight, basically the opposite. And so when we look at those organs, they often have the opposite effect in terms of a stress effect. So digestion is going to go down, right? Think about that. You get stressed, maybe you get constipated, something like that. Things are going to move very well, or your stomach's upset, etc. And then you think about your blood pressure being up, your pupils dilating so you can see all these things you're nervous about, things like that. Now, besides their overall effects, we also find that they have some structural differences too. We already saw preganglionic cell and postganglionic cell. The neurotransmitters that are released, like at the postganglionic cell, were different. You may have also noticed that the preganglionic and the postganglionic cells are different lengths, even looking at this figure here. So what we find, look at the parasympathetic. The preganglionic cell is very long, then there's our synapse, and there's a short postganglionic cell. Whereas in sympathetic, it's the opposite. Preganglionic is very short, and it's the postganglionic that has to make it the rest of the way. So here's your ganglion here. With the short first cell, we have to have that ganglion very close to the spinal cord. That's our sympathetic chain ganglion that we've been seeing. Whereas with the parasympathetic, with that first neuron, that preganglionic cell being very long, then you have what are called terminal ganglions that are near the target organ where those housings are going to be located. So make sure that you note these differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic as well. Notice as well, last thing, parasympathetic is often known as cranial, sacral, because that's where those parasympathetic fibers come out, whereas sympathetic is thoracolumbar, like you see coming out in the middle. So, like we saw, sites of origin, linked to fibers, and locations of ganglia. And even, at least at the terminal end, right before the effector organ, differences in terms of the neurotransmitter used. So table 14.1 does a good job of comparing those things. So you got to know these differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic. So this just shows some of the common pathways as we're getting out parasympathetic to a lot of the different organs. So you also need to know for particular organs how sympathetic is going to, stimulation is going to affect its activity, and how parasympathetic is going to affect it. So you need to have a lot of different examples of that so you can recognize what sympathetic is going to do and what parasympathetic is going to do. So like we said, sympathetic is going to come out in the thoracolumbar region. We see it again here, a little bit closer. When you look at that list of organs, when we look at parasympathetic, you're going to see, right, dual innervation. You're going to see parasympathetic going the same places. We said that the ganglion has to be very close because that first fiber is very short. So here's our sympathetic chain ganglion right next to the spinal cord. And here we can see how outside of that sympathetic chain ganglion, we see the second fiber being exceptionally long. Now, we saw that they release norepinephrine, right? Also called noradrenaline. And what you find that's interesting, I think it's interesting, you'll learn in 202 about a system called the endocrine system, right? So we have two control systems of the body. Nervous system, which is like the wired system, and then endocrine system, which is the wireless system. Well, it turns out sympathetic neurons go down and interact with some of these endocrine organs. So we see that one, that's going down to the adrenal gland, and the adrenal gland releases hormones from it, one of which is going to be epinephrine or adrenaline. And so what they think is that in fact the inner part of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal medulla, and they think that the adrenal medulla is like a modified postganglionic cell. So you get a preganglionic cell that goes into it, and the postganglionic cell is that core of the medulla, and that's where we release our epinephrine and our norepinephrine, just like we said happens in terms of the sympathetic nervous system. So you can see that there, in some cases with sympathetic nervous system, there's a second ganglion as well, right? So you see mesenteric ganglion, celiac ganglion. So we started out with this one, close to, and can be a second one as well. Okay, so what we're finding is that with the autonomic nervous system, it's stimulating these different involuntary organs. It's controlling their activity, increasing it or decreasing it, and it gives us these what are called visceral reflexes, right? Viscera means gut, and so we're going to see how we can get information from them, send it into kind of the simple parts of the central nervous system, and then send a response back. So the arcs that we talk about are in fact very simple, but they also represent how our nervous system is processing things. So when we look at it, there's lots of different gut-like reflexes. There are even some that involve the guts, and that's part of what's called the enteric nervous system. We'll see the enteric nervous system as we do digestion in Bio 202. But what we have is 5 parts of this reflex arc, right? So we got the stimulus that's coming in via the receptor. It sends it to a sensory neuron to relay it in. We see that here. The integration center is the brain of the spinal cord that makes a decision about it, compares it with the set point, etc. And then once we make a decision, it's the motor neuron that goes out that stimulates that visceral effector. So 5 steps of the reflex arc. But again, if we were just talking about processing something like reading something, same type of thing has to happen. Sensory, right, receptor that's picking up a stimulus, routing it into the brain, process it for a while, motor response going out, effector afterwards. Okay, so at this point what we're going to do is we've set up our situation in terms of autonomic nervous system. We've done some comparisons between somatic and autonomic. We've done some comparisons between sympathetic and parasympathetic, and now we're going to be continuing on. But even though it's a short chapter, we're going to stop here and we'll start it up with another one and finish the chapter as we move through another section about this size. So we don't want to tax you guys too much. We'll let you digest, if you will, via your parasympathetic stimulation, digest the information we've done so far, and we'll do another lecture that will finish it up soon.